The morning tide looked like a sheet of glass someone had breathed on and forgotten to wipe clean. Mira stood at the edge of the pier where the boards creaked in the old familiar rhythm of a lullaby she couldn't place. The gulls wrote white commas against a low sky, and the salt air felt gentle as gauze on the space in her chest where the world had been too loud for too long. She held a paper cup that had already cooled past comfort and watched a ferry shoulder through the channel, its wake untying the sea's careful braids. She was here to begin again, though she hadn't decided what that meant. The word again itself felt fragile in her mind, like a seashell pressed to listen for what you hope is there. She noticed him because he moved as though he were trying not to disturb the day, slow, deliberate, the posture of someone who apologized to chairs when he bumped them. Dark hair tucked behind one ear, a camera resting at his sternum, its strap worn to softness. He paused not far from her, took a photograph, and then another, and then lowered the camera in the way people lower a thought, carefully, as if it might spill. He glanced over and smiled, uncertain but warm, and the brief lift of his mouth felt like sunlight stepping out from behind a cloud. "It's quieter than the photos," he said, as if they'd already been talking. "I always forget that about water. Cameras catch the shine, not the hush." Mira nodded, because the hush was what she had come for. "The hush is the point," she said, surprising herself. He laughed softly. "Julian, Mira." Somewhere deep in the harbour, a buoy chimed like a spoon against a glass. He looked toward the sound, as though it had called his name, and then turned back. "I'm supposed to meet someone from the Historical Society," he said. "They want a series on the town, the houses, the hands that built them. But I keep pointing the lens at the tide." "Maybe the tide is what built them," she said, and the moment he smiled again, she felt an inexplicable, gentle tug, a sensation like remembering a melody without the words. She took a breath, and the air was soft with rain that hadn't chosen whether to arrive. He lifted the camera and gestured with a tilt. "May I?" he asked, and waited for her nod before taking a photo of the pier planks running away beneath her boots. He didn't take one of her, and that felt like a kindness. She had been looked at a lot in the life she'd left, measured for brightness, for being on, as if she were a lamp someone expected to switch back to full. They walked without deciding to, following the line of weather-faded shops, their windows dressed with hand-lettered signs, boiled shrimp, taffy, mended nets. The owner of the bookstore swept sand from the threshold and waved them in with the end of the broom. Inside, the smell of paper and dust and lemon oil was soothing, and Mira let her palms trail the spines like greeting old friends without needing to talk. Julian crouched to read the titles in a lower row, and when he stood, he was holding a book whose cover had once been blue. "Listen to this," he said, opening to a page in the middle. "It says, 'We return to the sea to find our beginnings, and the sea returns us to ourselves.' Poets always pretend they're writing about the ocean," she said, "but they're writing about loneliness." He looked at her, really looked, the way you look through a window at night and are startled to find your own reflection. "And do you read poets anyway?" "Only when I want to argue." They stepped back onto the street, and the light had shifted, thin and bright like silk drawn taut. She realized she was hungry, and then realized she had not felt hunger in weeks without pushing it away. Julian suggested the cafe with the blue door and the mismatched cups, and they sat by the window where condensation beaded into tiny universes and slid down to make room for more. He didn't ask her where she was from, or what she did, or why her hands trembled when the bell on the cafe door clanged loud. Instead, he asked about the small things that kept a day together. The best way to fold a sweater so it doesn't forget its shape, whether she kept flowers, and if so, which ones forgave neglect. She told him about the plant that lived stubbornly on her windowsill, and how it only bloomed when she forgot it, as if it preferred to be left alone to do its work. He told her about a grandmother who kept a jar of beach glass on her table and said you could turn anything soft if you let the water hold it long enough. They parted on the curve of the street, she to the rented room above the bakery that smelled tenderly of sugar in the mornings, he to the ferry to meet the people waiting for him. He didn't ask for her number. He looked as though he might, and then he didn't, and she respected the space that left. Still, as she climbed the narrow stairs and the floorboards announced her to the empty room, she knew she would find him again, the way you find a bench in a park you didn't mean to carry in your mind. At the window, she set the cooled coffee on the sill and listened to the rain finally decide. That night, she dreamed a shoreline she didn't recognize and woke with the name of it on her tongue. An old-fashioned word her mouth felt too modern to say. She wrote it down anyway, sounds turning to letters, and then to a quiet thrill that warmed the back of her neck. On her second morning, she took the path behind the lighthouse and found him there, kneeling to photograph a line of stones someone had arranged as if to measure the horizon. "Good timing," he said without surprise, as if he knew she'd be here when the tide reached the middle step. "It feels like we've done this before," she said. "Walked this path, said these words." "Maybe this town has a loop," he said, and then more softly, "or maybe we do." They walked again, slower this time, the kind of pace that lets a thought ripen. The wind, a little colder, pressed their coats against their ribs and made their breaths visible, proof they were here together. At the edge of the cliff, he pointed to a weathered bench whose plaque was rubbed almost blank. "Sit," he said, and when they did, the world arranged itself around the quiet between them. She told herself it was only weather making her eyes sting. He asked gently, "Can I tell you something without making you responsible for it?" "Yes," she said, grateful for the shape of the request. "I came because I needed some place that didn't know the worst of me," he said. "I wanted to see if I could be more than the last thing I ruined." She turned her head. His profile looked carved, from patience, from regret. "Do you believe you are?" she asked. "Some moments," he said, "when the sea forgives my questions." They went back along the path with the wind behind them this time, making the journey feel like something they'd earned. When they reached the lightkeeper's cottage, she told him her name again, and he said it as if receiving it rather than confirming. Their hands did not touch. The air between them felt soft and soothing in a way that suggested it had finally chosen them. And if, as she let herself back into the bakery's stairwell, she felt a little braver than the day before, well, that was a beginning too. She stood at the window and wrote a note in the margin of her journal. "If you felt the hush turn into a heartbeat here, leave a little love. Like a comment, subscribe, so this gentle path keeps leading us back." On the third morning she woke to fog, the harbour erased to a blank page the colour of pearl. The bakery below beat butter into sugar, a rhythm that promised the day would have sweetness if you knew where to stand. She made tea and poured it over the memory of last night's thoughts, letting them steep until they softened. When she stepped outside, the town sounded different. Voices dampened, gulls reduced to echoes. She found Julian at the pier, with his camera zipped into his coat and his hands in his pockets, as if he had come here intending to work, and then remembered that holding still is a kind of work too. "Can I show you something?" he asked. His voice was tender, a little hoarse, the way a voice is when it's been made peaceful by watching something alive and patient. She nodded, and he led her to the old boatyard where a shed leaned into the wind, like an old man telling a joke he knows takes time. Inside, it smelled of oil and cedar and the sweet hay scent of dry rope. Light fell through the slats in long, quiet ladders. On the workbench lay photographs, prints, not screens, arranged in a line like stones in a river you might cross if you trusted your ankles. He didn't explain them. He let her see. In one, the sea wore a face the color of pewter and held a broken oar. In another, the lighthouse stood not as warning, but as witness. A third was simply two mugs on the cafe windowsill, one with the heat still visible on the glass. He had captured the hush. He had found a way to make it look like it sounded. She touched the corner of a print with one finger, careful to keep her skin off the image the way someone reaches toward a sleeping child. "They feel soft," she said. "Even the sharp ones." "I want the town to see itself like this," he said. "Not what it sells, but what it holds." The words made her chest ache in a soothing way. She told him how she had come from a life where everything had to be stated and shown and proved until the proof became louder than the thing itself. "I used to think healing would look like a door swinging open," she said. "Now I think it's more like a window someone remembered isn't painted shut." They carried the photographs to the light, and while they dried, they walked down the quay. The fog lifted in veils, revealing houses with paint worn to truth, boats with names flaking off in pretty, brave curls. She found herself telling him about her brother's laugh, about the train stations of her childhood, about the teacher who showed her how to make sentences breathe by ignoring the rule that said you couldn't. He listened with the dignity of silence, eyes on the water, as if the water could keep her words and not lose them. He shared his own small shapes of pain, the friend he couldn't call any more, the road his father took and never returned from, the month he thought about stepping off one lonely edge and then didn't, because a woman on a bus asked him to hold her sleeping child while she tied her shoe, and the weight of that sleeping boy made him remember his hands were for carrying. They stopped talking for a while because they didn't need to, and the quiet turned gentle as weather that finally forgives the shore for staying. They ate soup in the cafe where the spoons clinked like tiny bells and steam made halos of their words. Outside, the fog left a thin brightness on every surface that made even the trash cans look newly washed. Along the wall hung photos of the town through the years, storms that had pulled roofs free and summers heavy with kites. Mira found one of the pier from decades ago, the same angle as a picture she'd seen in his stack, and she laughed to see two boys frozen mid-air on the railing, about to jump. "Do you ever think we are not new?" she asked. "That we're echoes finding each other again?" "I hope so," he said. "It makes all the wrong rooms feel like detours instead of destinies." They walked to the shore where the tide curled in little tender fists and then unclenched, rhythmic and soothing. She slipped off her shoes and stepped into the cold. It bit, and then, as bodies do, adjusted, found a way to make the chill into a companion instead of a threat. He rolled his pants and joined her, both of them shivering and laughing and not apologizing for either. The salt on the wind tasted like something the body already knew by another name. When she grew quiet, he asked with a tilt of his head rather than a push, and she told him about the night that made her leave, the night when a room full of applause had turned to noise, when she had smiled until her face ached and felt her heart harden around itself to be protected. The next morning she had woken with her voice far away. She spoke about that loss as if it had happened to a friend, because sometimes that was the only way to be tender to herself. He listened, then asked the smallest question. "And now?" "Now I can hear myself in the morning again," she said. "It's quiet, but it's mine." They began to see each other every day, without calling it a plan. The town noticed them, the way towns do, with a soft kind of curiosity that didn't demand anything in return. The baker put a second spoon in their coffee without asking. The bookstore owner set aside a battered anthology with an inscription that simply read, "For people who keep showing up." Julian photographed less and looked more. Mira wrote in a notebook that had waited too long in the bottom of a bag, words arriving like careful birds who test the air and then commit to flight. There were still days when the world pressed too close and her breath went shallow, when a loud voice in a narrow room turned her body into a bell someone had struck too hard. On those days he did not tell her to be brave. He walked with her to the bench near the cliff and counted inhales with her in a low voice, tender and steady, until the air grew peaceful again. When his own nights stacked up into a tall shadow and sleep would not open, she made tea and told him the boring parts of her day, the ripping of a seam and the dignity of mending it, the way the woman next door sang to her cat off-key, the satisfaction of getting the stubborn window to slide. Soft, soothing, ordinary things. They agreed that if you say the small, real things out loud, the large, frightening ones have less room to echo. One afternoon, the Historical Society held Julian's work in a hall that had once been a dance floor and still remembered feet. People came in their good sweaters and read plaques in their quiet voices. Mira watched strangers step closer to the hush he'd printed on paper, watched them soften in it, held by the same invisible thread. Julian asked her later what it felt like to see his work through her eyes, and she answered honestly, "It feels like watching someone gently put a mirror down and choose instead to pick up a window." They began to make a language, not the kind with grammar you could pass, but the kind made of gestures and timing, the hand on a shoulder that meant "I'm here" when words would have been a crowd, the small stone left on the bench to say "I made it through the morning," the way their laughs found the same pitch and decided to stay. In the evenings, they walked the length of the town and back, as if stitching it, as if making sure it didn't come unraveled while it slept. On a night when the sky turned the blue of good ink and the stars arrived without announcing themselves, they returned to the boatyard. He spread a blanket on the dry boards and showed her a new set of photographs, all taken so close you had to be patient to understand them. The grain of an oar, like geography, a ladder of light on a wall, the exact moment a wave took a footprint and perfected it by erasing. "I'm learning to see," he said, "by going nearer." "So am I," she said, and felt the truth find its home behind her ribs. He hesitated, then offered a picture he hadn't put with the others. She recognized the cafe window, 2 mugs, condensation drawing gentle shapes down the glass. But there, reflected in the pane, small and almost an accident, were two silhouettes whose edges had blurred into one line. He watched her face the way you watch a tide decide whether to reach your toes. "I didn't mean to take it," he said. "Or maybe I did." She turned to him with the quiet certainty that arrives when you realize you have already stepped across a threshold without noticing. The air between them felt tender, not because nothing had hurt, but because so much had, and yet here they were, soft, where they could have been sharp. When she reached for his hand, the gesture felt peaceful in her body, an ease she hadn't trusted would ever be hers. The harbor breathed. The buoy chimed. The hush the camera could not catch folded around them and made a shelter. Winter found them and did not undo them. The first storm iced the pier and taught them the slow dignity of walking without falling. When the power stuttered, they boiled water on the gas stove and ate soup that tasted better for being shared. On a brave morning between snows, they carried a thermos to the bench and watched the sea muscle itself against the wind until it remembered that all it needed to be was water. They spoke about the roads that had become rooms they would not return to. He told her the dangerous names that still lived in his phone, like little lit windows he did not open. She told him about headlines that had pinned her like a specimen, and friends who loved the spotlight more than the person standing in it. They did not perform each other's pain. They held it until the edges grew less sharp, until each story could be folded along its old crease and put away without being lost. On the night the town hung lights along the quay, the bulbs shivered in their strings like captured constellations. Music from someone's window floated soft and off-tempo, a tender human imperfection. The two of them walked with their shoulders brushing, as if remembering another lifetime in which they had learned how to stay. On the pier, the wind gathered enough to toss Mira's hair across her cheek, and Julian reached, without thinking, to tuck it back. The gesture was so simple it felt like a vow. "I don't want to promise more than I can hold," he said, words slow, as if weighed and found honest. "But I want to make a promise I can keep." "What kind?" she asked, her voice quiet to keep the world from listening too closely. "That when the quiet feels like an emptiness, I'll help turn it into a room," he said. "And when the noise returns, I'll help turn it back into a window we can open." She didn't answer with words. She stepped closer until the space in her chest that had once been a bruise pressed against the space in his that had been a warning. And together they made something softer. The kiss came not as a crescendo, but as a tide at rest, soothing and sure, a small bright mercy. It did not change the town, but it changed the way the town sounded, as if a door somewhere had stopped rattling in its frame. Afterward they laughed. Not for show, but because joy had surprised them in an ordinary place and insisted on being noticed. They made their way to the cafe and shared cake that tasted like birthdays and had too much frosting in a way that made them both grateful for excess. The woman at the counter slid an extra fork onto the plate as if she'd been waiting all season to do that for them, and they received it like a blessing. Not everything became easy. Some mornings he woke with photographs of old mistakes flashing in his head and had to let them pass until the real light arrived. Some afternoons she forgot how to trust the good and had to relearn it by naming 5 gentle things she could feel: the warmth of the mug, the soft yarn of her sleeve, the tender ache in her legs from walking, the peaceful hum of the refrigerator, the weight of his hand steadying the small of her back as they waited at the crosswalk. They became, for each other, a way to practice staying. In spring, when the town began to be found again by tourists with bright jackets and plans that folded and unfolded like maps, Julian was offered a gallery show in the city. He brought the letter to the bench because that's where decisions went to breathe. "It's the thing I thought I wanted," he said, "but wanting it used to mean needing to be seen. Now I want to show what can be looked at without needing to be looked at myself." She listened to the tide decide whether to fuss at the rocks. "We could go together," she said, "for the opening, then come home. We can let the city be a room, not a world." He smiled at the word home. At the show, people stood in their careful shoes and said careful things. Mira watched faces find the hush and soften. A man with an expensive watch asked Julian what filter he used to make water look like that, and Julian said, kind but firm, "I waited." On the train back, they sat with their knees touching and shared a pair of headphones. She rested her head on his shoulder and fell asleep to a song that felt like a long stretch of road where the lines kept you honest but didn't fence you in. Summer returned, and with it the bright, reliable work of mornings. They began to host small Sunday gatherings on the pier. Coffee in chipped mugs, a poem read badly but with heart, a child offering a shell with 2 holes as if it were currency. People came because there were no rules except to be, and being is rare enough to be worth attending. Mira read from her notebook sometimes, her voice soft but steady, the pages filled now with words that belonged to her in the way a breath belongs to its body. Julian hung a strand of lights from the shed to the boat and called it an idea. They took turns being the person who remembered the napkins. On a day when the sky wore a sudden temper, they ran from the storm together, laughing as rain stitched wet threads through their clothes and made the world new. Under the awning, dripping and bright-eyed, she felt the old urge to armor against joy. Because what if it was taken? And then felt it pass like weather, finally moving on. She exhaled and leaned into him, and the gesture felt like not hiding. He kissed her forehead and spoke into her damp hair. "We keep choosing this," he said, "even when the light is ordinary, especially then." "Especially then," she echoed. They walked home, shoes making soft arguments with the puddles, and in the room above the bakery they peeled off wet layers and hung them on the radiator, made tea, watched the steam rise like small forgiving ghosts. The window, which once stuck, slid easily now. The town smelled like rain and bread and fresh paint on old wood. They didn't speak for a while. They didn't need to. The hush had learned their names. At the end of that summer, when the town's edges began to gold and the first sweaters came down from the high shelf, they returned to the bench with a thermos and a question they had carried like a bright stone. He took her hand and placed a ring in it that wasn't new, just simple and true. A circle that looked like it had always meant to live on her finger. "No grand speech," he said. "Just this. Stay." She looked at him, at the sea holding itself together, at the town that had learned to hold them. She thought about healing, not as erasing what had been, but as letting it belong without ruling. "Yes," she said, "let's stay." They did not believe in perfect. They believed in repair. They believed in mending the places that tear, in making beauty of evidence, in showing their seams. They believed in mornings when nothing dramatic occurred, and the miracle of that. They believed in the soft riot of two lives learning to be one life without losing their names. They believed in Sundays on the pier and Mondays that lasted too long, and in the right to return and try again. They believed that love could be gentle, could be tender, could be soothing, could be peaceful, and still be strong enough to hold. And if this story has brought you a breath you didn't know you were holding, if it has set something quiet and warm moving in your chest, let it keep traveling. Like, comment, subscribe, so the path between us stays lit, even on fog-soft mornings.